So I'm going to lead now into how you met, your husband,
My husband,
but
yeah.
it leads to the start. The question is, what did you do socially and entertainment wise?
Okay,
You know,
all
so
right.
I'll ask that as a question.
Already did.
I just did, yeah. What did you do?
Well, as I said before, we went to concerts and operas, and that was a very social thing for young people. You see, we had no real choice. We either brought into the communist propaganda films or plays, or we stayed with the classic like our parents. So it's not that we were so good that we did not rebel against our parents. We had no
Yeah,
choice.
that was the
I never heard of Elvis Presley until I got to Canada.
right.
Okay? So we went to school dances. I think I mentioned that. We went to school dances. And we also went to uh, 5 o'clock tea, where there was music. And you went there for and you had an espresso, and there was a live band. And if you were a single girl, well, there was no such thing as single girl. You had to have a chaperone, but you had no boyfriend with you. Then the guys were going around and asking girls to dance. So this is actually exactly how I met Gabi. That I went to a 5 o'clock tea with my friend who lived in London and her mother. And Gabi went around the table and looked around whom to ask for a dance and asked me. And that's how we met. And he did ask me for a date the next day. And I said, I can't go because I'm going rowing on the Danube. Oh, but we can meet after. What happened was that I didn't put on suntan lotion and I burned myself crisp on the water. So I went to the first date as a fried chicken.
He
But
must have laughed.
but it must have been okay just the same.
So what was? Do you remember what that first date was? You just met for coffee again,
My
or
coffee, yeah, that
okay?
was customary. That was in the summer, so we were outside in a cafeteria, and yeah, that was just.
What did you think of him when you met him?
He was the most handsome man I have seen, and he was. He was exceptionally handsome. By Hungarian standard, he was very tall. Yeah, and yeah, I think he was an extremely handsome guy, and I didn't understand what he wanted from me. I never was a special beauty, so but he sort of liked me, and we started dating. I was very young. Yeah, I
How
was
old were you?
17,
17.
and he was 23, so he was much older. He was working. He made money and was able to take me to a restaurant, not just for a coffee, but going for dinner. And I was very impressed. Yeah, I also liked him.
Yeah.
Also, I felt that I felt comfortable with him because you don't notice it, but in Hungary, you right away, I noticed that he was Jewish. He didn't have to tell me, I mean, it was absolutely written on his face. And that appealed to me, I have to admit.
How long did you date before you introduced him to your family?
Not very long, because he came to visit me. He came to visit. That was our dating, actually. that he came to visit me every single night.
Oh, really?
Yes. And my mother stayed in the kitchen, and we were in the living room, the two of us. And my mother came in with sandwiches for supper. Because in Hungary, you have your main meal at noon. And so my mother made sandwiches and brought it in, and everybody accepted that Kati has a boyfriend.
Do you remember talking to your mom about him and what she thought?
My mother really liked him quite a lot. Liked him quite a lot. And it wasn't really long after that he did ask me whether I would marry him. It wasn't that,
Are we talking 6 months?
yeah, maybe 6 months, yeah. And I didn't take him seriously, I have to admit.
So was it a proposal or
Yes,
just,
he was proposing, and as a matter of fact, in those days, he asked my mother for my hand. And my mother said, yeah, she has no problem with it, but I was too young, we have to wait.
till 18?
Well, it happened that the revolution happened and
Yeah.
I got married. But it was not a very serious thing. At that time, I didn't take it seriously. I was too young to take it seriously. But after a while, I started to take it seriously, and we were supposed to have a very small engagement party, not a wedding, engagement party, um, October 28th, which was a Sunday. And my father-in-law gave us the wedding ring from Gabi's mother and his. Because it was too big for me, Gabi took it to the jeweler to have it custom made for my finger, and so was his. Was supposed to be ready for the 28th, yeah, for the engagement, but he had nothing to do on the 23rd on the morning, so he decided to ask the jeweler whether the ring was ready or not because he would like to, and he picked it up, which was a good thing because by the afternoon the revolution started, and later on the whole store was looted.
So this is a good opportunity to now talk about the revolution and how the revolution affected you, and obviously did.
So actually, the revolution is the result of a slow build-up of political changes that happened in Hungary in 1956 when the 20th Congress in Moscow denounced Stalin. And that made such a huge difference in the whole political arena that people felt much, much freer to start opening up a little bit. So there were newspapers, there were writers who were writing a little bit freer, and it felt in the air that something is changing. The revolution itself, it started as a student demonstration for the Polish uprising a few months ago, and we were in favor of the Polish uprising, And that was a demonstration to their solidarity. And then what happened was it is really like a snowball. It started as a student demonstration, and it's just without any organization. It just started to grow. First, the workers joined. I personally, when I came out from my work at 3 o'clock in the afternoon, I saw people were marching, and I said, "Where are you going?" And they said, "We are going to the to
The radio station.
radio station, to ask that our demand will be published. And would you like to come with us, little girl?" Someone yelled from a truck. And I said, "Why not?" So I went myself. And it's just people were just gathering from the street, and it just grew
But you
bigger
knew
and bigger.
something special was happening.
Everybody knew it was something special. It was not organized by any means. As I said, it grew to be a huge demonstration. I went with the group to the radio, and we were shouting and actually having fun, while people were gathered bigger and bigger numbers.
So what was the reason they were all going to the radio station? What?
The students had a 12-point demand, but they wanted to achieve freedom of speech. There were no real requests for the government to resign. They wanted to have a different prime minister,
Who was that?
Imre.
Okay.
Yeah. But other than that, they wanted to have human socialism. That's what they asked for. And also, at the last point, they wanted to have the Russian army out of Hungary. So they wanted to have those points on the radio announced.
Let me back up for a second. When you say get the Russian army, did the Russian army have a huge
The Russian
presence?
army never left. There were always parts of Hungary. There were Russian army
In Budapest too?
in Budapest, also outside of Budapest. But yes, there were the Russian army never left Hungary. As happy as we were when they came, the only problem was that they never left. And so one of those requests was that.
And this was October 23rd.
That was October 21st on a Tuesday afternoon, going into the evening. By the time the huge crowd came to the radio, there were another group going to the parliament. In front of the parliament, there is a huge square. That's where they gathered. It was filled with people demanding the Imre Nagy to come and take over the government, who was also a communist, you have to understand, but a friendlier uh, person. And of course, the AVO, which is the Hungarian KGB, was on the top of the building with guns and everything. And so it started to feel a little bit queasy for me. But anyhow, after they said that the demand will not be met by the radio station, they started shooting, I think, to the air first. I say I think because as soon as I heard shooting, I turned around and I ran home without stopping. which was quite a feat because I lived in Buda and that was in middle of Pest. But that was my end of the fighting of the
Your
revolution.
revolutionary days.
But by the evening, they were shooting real people, and they called the Hungarian army to uh, to help, and that's when really truly the revolution started. When the Hungarian army refused to shoot at people, but sided with the people.
So you ran home.
I ran home, and that was the end of my uh, participation actually in the revolution.
Did your mother know what had happened?
My mother heard something but didn't know what was happening. Everybody knew something was happening, but there were no uh, immediate newscasts as now. Uh, there were no telephones. There were no, well, I mean, we had telephones, but not cell phones to let them know that what's happening. So, uh, by the way, Gabi went to the parliament building to demonstrate. So he was there.
At the same time you were.
At the same time I was at the radio, he was at the
Oh, okay.
parliament. But so I went home. The next morning, I mean, talking about early morning because you can imagine we didn't sleep much. The next morning, well, my apartment building was in a square. And there were 17 Russian tanks stationed in that square, and we saw them coming.
So this also means that Gabi never came to visit you.
Not that time, no, no. And no, for a week we were not communicating.
Talk on the phone?
He called once because most of the phones were disconnected, but having the fortune that my father's name was Dr. Andregunci, our phone was still working because they thought he was a doctor. So very soon the fighting started where I lived because kids were throwing Molotov cocktails in front of the tanks and they started shooting. The tanks were starting to shoot. Pretty soon I started yelling, I want to go to the bunker, I want to go to the bunker. I guess all my war memory came back and I was really, really
So
affected by the noise and by the shooting and everything. So we went on to the bunker.
So what you're saying is you could hear, could you see the fighting?
Oh, yeah, yeah, yeah. Fighting started. And to see the 17 Russian tanks was enough. But as I said, they started shooting also. And so we went down to the bunker, everybody. And for the first few days, we sort of lived in the bunker. It wasn't like the war when the siege was on, but it was safer to stay down because there were some serious fighting in our district. It also very much depended where you lived.
Did Gabi
I have to admit that the Russian tanks did not shoot the in a district where there were no provocation for it.
Did they
So-
go? Was there fighting in where Gabi and his father lived?
No. Again, that was a different district where people were not fighting. But our area was a very central point where quite a few of the important highways from the country came in.
So who were the revolutionaries fighting now? Because you said it hadn't been organized; it just materialized. So how did
Well,
they?
the army, that really caused the army actually gave out um, ammunition to the people. In Hungary, people had no guns, nothing, zero, not a few guns here and there. They had no guns. It was all coming from the army.
Did the army join in fighting too?
The army joined in fighting, and people, the students, by that time, the whole working class workers came from different areas. They were fighting. So that went on for few days. Speeches were on the radio. Politicians, famous sport people were trying to stop the revolution. Nothing worked. And then all of a sudden, the Russians withdrew. So that was the first week of the revolution. The fighting were not as serious as later on. The Russians withdrew. I know, but first I have to tell you that we couldn't believe it. We were so happy that it was just unbelievable. There was 1 week of complete happiness of what happened.
You thought maybe the Russians were gone forever.
The Russians, we later learned, withdrew because they were not equipped for that kind of warfare. So they withdrew and they pretended that everything was fine. But we later learned that a more serious Russian army were already at the border coming in, and the provisional government, new government was already established at the border, on the east border of the country, which we didn't know anything about, of course.
So the Russians left.
The Russians withdrew.
The radio station started.
There were speeches from, well, some of it I liked, some of it I didn't like, but the very famous Archbishop made a speech. All kind of speeches were talking about the government will come, which is democratic, and so on and so on. So for a week, we were just really very happy. And I went to visit my aunt in Pest, just because she lived very close to Gabi. And so we were getting together with Gabi, visiting him and his father. And in those days, wherever you saw people lining up in a store, food store, you lined up yourself because food was scarce and you never know what you get, yeah? And by the time we were in line, Gabi and I were in line, by the time we get served, there was only a bunch of carrots that we got. Okay, so we took the carrots and went to visit my later father-in-law, who was very happy to see it and said, "Oh, that's wonderful. Now, Kati, make a stew of it." Huh? I had no idea what to do, but fortunately, the Gabi's neighbor, the same neighbor who was hiding him during the war, helped me out and made the carrot stew. And that was, my father-in-law really liked it. I don't know if you ever learned that I didn't make it. So there were some terrible atrocities committed during that first week. There was a huge gathering in front of the parliament, and the Russian tanks were surrounding it, but AVO, the Hungarian KGB, were on the top of the buildings around it and started shooting at the people. And it was horrible that the Russian tanks were taking in people and trying to save them for the AVO. So that's one of the terrible thing that happened. So
So a sense of timing, just so that I understand how many days. So from the time.
there was about a week. It started on the 23rd, and about a week when fighting, and then a week of happiness. And on the 4th of November, on a Sunday, we woke up, and on the radio, there was no regular schedule, but the national anthem and the voice of the new prime minister asking for help
Asking for help from who?
from the Western countries, for whoever was listening, that we are being attacked by the Russians. And that was basically the end. That was basically the end. Then a real well equipped Russian army came in, and the fighting was. It was going on for quite a few days, but it was really the end of it. The new prime minister and army, I don't know what was his rank, major, was of course called in. Actually, they said they are going to negotiate, but of course they did not negotiate. They kept them, and the prime minister actually was able to go to the Yugoslav embassy for a while, but anyway, later he was executed, and so was the the major, yes,
So,
and many other people, of course.
so from your perspective, did you go to work during those days? Did Teddy go to work?
I went to work in the happy time. I went to work, and we got paid. Money was just flowing. I don't know why. This was crazy world. This was crazy world, unreal world. And yes, we went into work that time when we were able to move around. And Gabi was elected as a manager of the company because the old manager was dismissed as an old communist. And everybody had a file, just like you must have read it from the Stasi. Everybody had a file.
Similar to a KGB file.
Yeah, like the KGB file. And Gabi saw his own files, and he learned that he was a class enemy and all that thing. But of course, after the Russians came in, it all ended. And
So after they came in,
the fighting, officially, the fighting ended on the, let's say, the middle of November, from the 4th. But of course, that was very sporadic, and it wasn't. I I was not at. I was not home. I got stuck with my aunt. I was at my aunt on the 4th of November. So I was able to go home only a week after, and it was not a good time for me because I think you remember the pictures, how damaged the building was, and the building beside our building was completely burned out. So by that time, even our telephone wasn't working. So I couldn't go home, and I heard nothing about my family. But I knew there were serious fighting where I lived.
So when you went home,
So
you
when I
saw it.
went home, our place was not damaged too badly, a little bit here and there, but nothing serious. And so I went home, and
But I will tell you, when I see pictures of the damage, you must have been shocked when you.
well, it was not very pleasant. So
Your mother must have been thrilled to see you.
well, it was nice to be home again,
Uh,
and then life started again. Went
can
back.
I also ask,
Do you know what happened to Aniko during this time?
Paniko was home.
She was home the whole time.
She was home the whole time, fortunately. Yes. Yeah.
So university. Was she at university
No,
at
by
that?
that time she finished university. She was teaching. Yeah. And yeah, she was, but she didn't go to school. There were no schools. So she was at home, fortunately. And life started. I went back to work. We pretended to work. And,
what do you mean you pretended to work?
well, work didn't come back in a regular, normal way. I mean,
So you
and
didn't
then
have
we
much to
just we
do.
just heard all the time people were leaving to the west, and the border was open, which was a great thing to. It, you can't appreciate it. Before '56, between Austria and Hungary, there was a minefield, and part of the change in the political system was that they cleared the minefields. Fortunately, that's why I was able to come.
Absolutely.
So things were not back to normal, but we lived.